Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session looking at the UNFCCC framework and specifically ahead to COP26, how climate finance can be mobilized for Pacific small island developing states. Although, of course, this conversation has a much wider impact for small island developing states, or SIDS, around the world as well. We're very pleased in this session to have been able to work with FBC in Fiji to record a conversation with Nigel Topping, the UN climate change high-level champion for the UK for COP26 last year, who will be talking with Zarek Khan, the Director for Programs and Initiatives at the Pacific Island Forum, and Lisa Buggy, the Risk-Informed Development Specialist at the United Nations Development Programme Pacific Office. This interview will center around, as I said, mobilizing climate finance in the Pacific Island SIDS and the big challenges that they are facing in achieving climate goals and climate finance as we look forward to Sharm el-Sheikh, the COP27, which will be hosted this year by Egypt. We're very happy at Island Innovation to have had last year at COP26 a virtual island space. We aim to do the same again this year, where we will be trying to be a point of connection between islands around the world and what is happening on the ground at COP27. So do keep an eye out for that. But without further ado, I will go ahead and ask our panelists to take it away. Thank you very much, everybody.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're listening from. Thank you for the invitation to the Islands Finance.
Apologies there, just having a slight technical connection issue. If you just give me 1 second, I'm going
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Restart the session.
Good morning, good afternoon, good limited, but also issues around insurance and just how much uninsured losses many emerging and developing countries have, and how that can also contribute to a cycle which is hard to get out of. But we're going to be looking at all this through the lens of how to access finance, but novel forms of finance. One thing I've noticed is that usually when the title is how to access climate finance, the conversation is all about the process for applying to and getting GCF funds. So we're not going to talk about that. That's, of course, part of the puzzle, but if that's the only part that we look at, then we'll miss the bigger picture of needs and opportunities. And I'm delighted to be speaking with Zarek Khan, who's the Director of Policy and Programs for the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, and Lisa Buggy, who's a Development Specialist for the UNDP Pacific Office. Now, I am not an expert in the Pacific Islands, which is why I'm asking the questions, but I don't have the answers. And so it's really great to have the individual and institutional expertise that Zarek and Lisa bring to help us understand the very real needs and the difference in those needs in the particular geographic and development context of Pacific Islands, but also the very real initiatives that are already underway, which maybe point a way to promising solutions which can be scaled. I think everybody listening here understands the unique vulnerability of small island communities, and also I would say the unique role that Small Island Voice has played in raising the global call for high levels of ambition. One thing which my colleague, until recently, Gonzalo Munoz, was very clear on when he became high-level climate action champion is that we must stand firmly behind and be informed by the science, which tells us that we've really got to get to net zero as quickly as possible, which is why we called our first campaign the Race to Zero. So let me start with you, Lisa. Obviously, the countries of the Pacific are all small. I mean, even the biggest countries are small countries. Some of them are very small. As I said, often when we hear talk about access to climate finance, it's a question of the process of applying for external funds. But I know you've been thinking a lot about what can countries do themselves to become more attractive. So maybe say a little bit about the national reform that might be required to make inward flows, particularly private capital, more likely.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on this panel today. So, as you mentioned, often when climate finance access and finance accessing is mentioned, there is a lot of enthusiasm, I guess, for the Green Climate Fund. What actually UNDP and PIFs have undertaken in partnership with the UK recently was research around actually looking more now at climate finance effectiveness, really shifting that narrative from this discussion around access to, well, is this a topic about just more quantities of funding, or is it broader than that?
You mean more input, as it were?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
More at the output.
Yeah. But how do we actually, the funding that's coming in, how do we actually utilise that more effectively, particularly in terms of getting outcomes for communities and people in the Pacific? So one of the things that our project is working on at UNDP, I'm part of a project, a governance strengthening project, is really looking at national systems and governance reform to ensure that, particularly in the realm of PFM, of national financing and planning, that these systems are cognizant, I guess, of climate change and disaster risks, and those are at the core of these kind of basically development decisions that are being made. So it's really more a kind of holistic approach to development and ensuring that any sort of financing has those components at the core, and therefore basically enabling more effective outcomes at a community level.
Could you give an example of how that approach, what sort of decision might that approach change?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I guess the end goal to that is ensuring that any sort of climate financing or any financing that's coming in for those sort of initiatives is utilising the national systems in place. Right. So instead of setting up, say, a project management unit that kind of works alongside the Ministry of Agriculture, it's actually embedding that whole process in the Ministry of Agriculture. So you're actually not creating, I guess, an additional burden on capacity in particular with external financing, and you're kind of utilising the national development framework to bring about more resilient outcomes.
Yeah, maybe we might talk about the need for capacity building and some of the gaps later. I heard a sort of structured approach, so there's capacity development, which is the ideal, then capacity supplement, and then capacity substitution. I think what you're talking about is moving up that hierarchy towards embedding and therefore developing beyond maybe the specific project for further capability.
Exactly.
Great. I mean, I'm going to come back in a minute to ask you about some of the good examples that you're seeing of structures that are helping bring in new sources of finance. But let me turn to Zarek first. Zarek, within the forum, tell us a little bit about some of the ways you're thinking about, as I said, going beyond the kind of one project at a time, and GCF as the primary source to think about how we can go bigger and faster.
Well, thanks, Nigel. I think you've hit the nail on the head, basically. The GCF obviously is a very important source of support for the region when it comes to the commitments under the Paris Agreement. But if you look at the level of support that has been channeled towards the Pacific region, I think over the past 6 years, it's about $500 million worth of projects. But in terms of our annual needs when it comes to climate financing, I think one of the reports highlighted that by 2030, all small island developing states will need about $12 billion annually. And for the Pacific region, we make up about 25% of the total SIDS in the world. So you're looking at about roughly $3 billion annually of climate finance support. So the GCF by and of itself won't be able to support all the needs of the Pacific. We need, by a way of necessity, to look beyond the GCF. Particularly, I think the work that you've done with former Governor Carney is excellent. The Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero. You're looking at 450 plus firms with over $130 trillion in assets. I think that's a conversation, unfortunately, that's been missing in the Pacific region up to this point. Certainly that's something that the forum will be actively working towards in terms of having a conversation with our finance ministers when they next meet in a couple of months' time, hopefully in Vanuatu. Certainly, as you pointed out a bit earlier, for us in the Pacific region, climate change is a lived reality. We're on the front line. Our countries have, despite that, shown a very strong global leadership when it comes to climate issues. Former Minister of Foreign Affairs for RMI, the late Tony de Bruym, was one of the chief architects of the Paris Agreement in terms of the High Ambition Coalition. Fiji was one of the first countries to actually ratify the Paris Agreement. We've done it through our NDC commitments, we've done it through our net zero commitments by 2050, and so we've taken a leadership role. Now what we're asking is for the biggest emitters in the world to play their part. I think the time for the Pacific in terms of carrying the bucket for the developed countries is over. We need to have an open mind about these issues. We need to start working much more closely with the private sector, the pension funds, the investment banks, those that have made a commitment that yes, they will be helping us achieve the climate financing goals under the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, you mentioned the work we've done with Mark Carney at GFANZ. We published some research just before the COP that suggests globally that about 70% of all the finance that is needed on mitigation and adaptation will have to come from the private sector. So we're going to have to figure out ways of structuring things to do that. I'd like to come back later to talk a bit about when I visited the Caribbean last year, I was struck by several of the examples that I saw where, although there's a obvious investment case for switching from expensive imported hydrocarbons to cheap, locally abundant renewables, there were often structural barriers in forms of maybe the licensing arrangement with the grid operator or the ownership structure. So maybe I'll come back to you in a minute and say what's the route to really accelerating the path to net zero? Because I take your point that I think we're now post COP26 in the implementation phase. I think finally the developed world has heard the science and heard the plea for focusing on 1.5. I mean, that's actually landed as part of the Glasgow Climate Pact, extraordinary ratcheting of ambition. And so there's a lot of people now really focusing on implementation. I think that there's a chance, if you like, for the new moral authority of island leadership to come from accelerated implementation, as long as it works financially, right? So Lisa, back to you. Can you give us some examples that you've seen from UNDP of ways of structuring which perhaps get to bigger levels of aggregation and allow us to bring in other sources of finance than just a relatively limited amount of multilateral money? Yeah,
sure. And I think this is a really key point in terms of being aware of other types of financing out there. This conversation is often focused very narrowly, and I think as we go, understanding the mechanisms, the financing mechanisms that are really contextually relevant for the Pacific. What's going to work, what's going to scale, what's going to replicate. The UNDP with UNCDF and the United Nations Environment Program are currently implementing a global fund for coral reefs. So this is a blended financing facility, really to mobilise private sector investment with public sector investment for the conservation of coral reefs, conservation and protection of coral reefs. So it really kind of utilises both these modalities to sustain financing through the private sector investment while still doing, I guess, a more programmatically driven projects around conservation for the coral reefs. And the aim of that fund is to leverage about US $50 million in private investment by 2030. Similarly, the United Nations Development Program here in the Pacific is also working again with the United Nations Capital Development Fund on a Pacific Insurance and Climate Adaptation Program. So this is the first time that a microinsurance product has been made available, and it's a parametric insurance product. So
maybe explain what that means. I've learned what parametric means, but it won't be familiar to everybody, so maybe explain what that means.
So it's based on the weather events. Yeah, so at the moment, and the trigger is the weather event, and the trigger is the weather event and the criteria associated with that, rather than being based on the destruction caused.
Yeah, so the benefit being that the insurance will pay out as soon as the wind speed hits the trigger level.
Exactly, rather than being based on the damage and the damage assessment.
Apply, have a loss adjuster come in 6 months later when it's particularly for the most vulnerable, maybe too late to be of any benefit. Exactly. So that's really interesting. I saw some of that also happening in the Caribbean, so it's great to hear that that's happening here.
Yeah, and what's great about it is that it's a micro-insurance product, so it's at the household level. Yeah. So at the moment covering, I think, 1,300 households in Fiji for cyclone storm damage, which is really critical because often, this hasn't really been available at that level up until now. And obviously we have literally yearly cyclones here in Fiji and obviously across the Pacific and the potential for that to increase. And so that's going to be piloted in Tonga and Vanuatu as well, and has already...
So it started here, but it's already going out to other countries in the region. Great.
Yeah, that's right. And already attracted investment from, I think, Australia, New Zealand, Luxembourg, and India. So, really interested to see how that...
Quite broad.
Yeah.
That's something I've only just become aware of, that I think the stat is in emerging and developing countries, climate losses are covered between 1% and 4%. So in other words, almost all losses are uninsured. And in developed countries, it's between 40 and 50%. So there's still a lot of uninsured loss, but that's enough to give stability for people to plan lives and invest in their future. When if it's everything being wiped out, especially the frequency that you talked about.
Yeah, exactly.
Great.
Exactly.
So that's a couple of really interesting. So the Coral Reef Fund is global, so it attracts capital at a global scale, and then channels it into, rather than the project due diligence being the gateway to the capital initially, the capital, and then the insurance is just a very different way of delivering resilience. So Lara, back to the thing that I'm grappling with is what are the barriers to just accelerating the transition to fully renewable island economies? And I guess you could follow that up with electric mobility, because we know that it's just much cheaper in the long run, so maybe there's a financing barrier. Given that I hear that particularly for the smaller, and I know here in Fiji we have quite a lot of hydro, but it's slightly different, but in many of the smaller islands it's only imported hydrocarbons, and so very expensive electricity. What's stopping us just getting there much quicker?
Well, firstly, I'd like to commend you for coming to the Pacific. I think in order to understand the Pacific, you need to be here and see the challenges that we face firsthand. And I think the biggest challenges we face, for example, is the geographical isolation that we have, the remoteness. I'm sure it took you a couple of flights and many hours to get to Suva. So it's not very easy for those that are decision makers back in Europe or in the Northern Hemisphere to understand the practical realities that we as Pacific Islanders face on the ground here in the region. Apart from that, it's the economies of scale. So here we are talking about, as you said, very small islands. Our membership, we've got 18 member states. It ranges from about close to 2,000 people in Niue to about close to 30 million people in Australia. And in between, we have our foreign island countries as well, with varying degrees of populations as well. And so,
but mostly in the sort of tens to hundreds of thousands range, right? Which is very, very small in terms of investability. Yeah.
Correct. So that makes the challenge of implementing adaptation resilience projects, quite challenging, even mitigation projects as well, especially when you look at the cost factor. So I mean, it takes between $5,000 to $10,000 at the moment to get a container out of Australia or New Zealand because of the supply chain issues that we're facing. That's about 300% the cost that someone would normally pay in Europe to get access to goods and services.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, to answer your question very specifically, especially when it comes to connectivity challenges, when it comes to access to infrastructure, to utilities, we have some of the most expensive electricity rates in the world, even water costs as well. A lot of our islands, unfortunately, don't have access to good drinking water. So we have to find alternative sources for that as well, and climate change is exacerbating that problem. But just to perhaps amplify that point as well, if you look at the global climate finance resources being channeled towards adaptation and resilience building, it's only about 20%. And this is actually where the Pacific is requesting a lot more focused to be channeled towards, because we haven't actually put up the white flag and said that we've given up. Our Pacific people are warriors. They're still fighting, they're still battling very hard, whether it's in the policy area, the political area, or trying to get the resources that we need.
But this is exactly my point about, was why my question is about speeding up investment in renewables, because that is where there's a business case which, structured right, will bring in private finance. So it will free up limited fiscal headroom locally and public finance. So to your point, I have a sense that too much public money is going into the easy mitigation and not enough private money, and that both those things are meaning there's less money available for the harder work on resilience. So what's again, this is a naive question from an outsider, right? So I'm understanding that there are different constraints, but given the very low cost of solar now, for example, what would stop the islands coming together to form an investment vehicle which was part public finance, concessional finance to de-risk, and then open to international investors on a bond type return, given the predictability of the income you can get from, which would basically say bundle the demand, projectize it within the vehicle rather than the project due diligence being the barrier to access to finance. Because you do a lot of things very collaboratively here. I know collaboration is difficult, but is that the sort of thing that people are looking at, or that you think might be possible to try and accelerate and to bring in more private capital?
Well, that's an excellent point, and I think one way that the Pacific Island countries have tried to sort of address that issue is through the establishment of the Pacific Resilience Facility.
Right.
So it's the first of its kind. It's Pacific-owned, Pacific-designed, Pacific-led. It's been driven at the leaders level and also by our finance ministers. And so what we're hoping to do later this year is have a global pledging event in New York with the support of the UN Secretary General's office. We're hoping to mobilize about $1.5 billion US dollars. So this is a concrete example of our foreign island country member states coming together, pulling our resources together, making sure that we've got our PFM systems, our public financial management systems, robust and in line. And what will happen with the Pacific Resilience Facility is that it will mobilize resources to then channel it into small community grants, to actually direct it towards the projects you've been mentioning, whether it could be renewable projects, it could be, for example, early warning hazard systems, it could be seawalls, it could be a community hall, for example, that is resilient and built to cyclone category 5 certification standards so that it doesn't get blown away. And so in the event of a climate-induced disaster, you have the villagers who can basically evacuate to that community hall. I can use the example of the 2016 Cyclone Winston that we had in Fiji. A lot of people unfortunately passed away, close to 50, we had 50 fatalities, and a lot of them unfortunately were killed because of corrugated tin that was basically flying around in the air.
Like a guillotine in there.
Correct, and unfortunately, that's a sign that a lot of the buildings, unfortunately, in the rural areas, not just in Fiji, but in other island countries, unfortunately, aren't built to the standards that can now withstand the intensity of the cyclones and disasters that we have.
So one of the things that I've heard a lot while I've been here is that, and of course it's not surprising given the small size of a lot of the countries in the region, is that there are capacity constraints. So sometimes, even though there might be a good business case for investment, there's a lack of capacity to get to the point where investment can flow. So I wonder if you could both give us a sense of what some of those capacity constraints are, and some ideas of what some of the things that you're seeing that are helping to address those. Maybe I'll start with you, Lisa.
Sure, thanks, Nigel. So I think in terms of some of the capacity constraints, I talked about earlier the way that financing systems are currently set up is kind of creating this additional burden outside of current national systems.
Yeah.
So you're almost doubling the already existing capacity issues, because you're now then also expecting a project management unit or a project team, as well as your national government capacity systems, which are already quite at their peak. I think you've also got, as we talked about, a lot of really quite small countries with small public services, and who are also dealing with, I guess, quite a number of development issues, and climate change and things like COVID and pandemics being added on top. I think with the pandemic, what's been really interesting to see, particularly across the region with borders being closed, and people not being able to travel, is this shift in realising the need for investing in capacity, obviously local capacity on the ground, and building that up through various mechanisms. So the one of the things that the project that I've been working on has done is putting government positions to do the work, some of the work of the government systems reform work that we are doing, and so they're actually government positions that will advocate for as UNDP consultant positions and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think some of that has been happening, particularly also in the disaster space, the recovery space. Obviously, with Tonga recently, you've seen that it's hard to get what would usually be international consultants in. So I think that's kind of going to be a bit of a movement across the near future of identifying what those kind of technical constraints have been and building that capacity as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Zarek, how about you? What do you see as some of the capacity constraints and some of the things that are being done to address them?
No, I think this is probably an area where development partners can play a major role, like the UK government, for example. And one example that I can give you is just earlier this year, with the support of the Australian and the government and the European Union, the Forum Secretariat worked with an organisation called TAFE, which delivers technical and vocational training. And we had applications from over 2,000 people from across the Pacific. We had to select about 200 participants, and these were young people, our youths. They were practitioners on the ground, they were climate activists. And we put them through a short course in terms of developing project proposals, so that they can access funding opportunities. And so this has been one of the biggest constraints that we faced in the Pacific region, the ability to develop bankable projects and have the expertise to try and do that. So I'm hopeful that our development partners can come on board, work with the UNDP, Forum Secretariat, and other agencies who are working in this space. And I think the focus should be on the youth. This is the future, and I think for a lot of the COP26 and other conferences we've seen, the youth voice is so crucial. But we need to provide them with the training and the capacity building opportunities so that they can take up these opportunities when they arise.
Oh, I've just been to the University of the Pacific. It's been really impressive to see some of the work that some of the future leaders are already doing there. I mean, there's a couple of examples I've seen of capacity building. One your colleague Yama was talking about the floating budget preparation team, like recognising that different islands have different fiscal years, so sort of pan-island team that can help provide sort of spikes of support that are needed when preparing budgets. And then there's also the climate finance advisors network that's relatively new, like creating new positions in government that are funded externally but are then trained, but also create a network. I think that idea seems to me a really exciting idea to build those networks across islands. Look, I think we come to the end of our time. We could go on a lot longer. I'm really I'm first of all really humbled by the complexity of what everyone here is dealing with, as you say, given the kind of geographic constraints and the way those turn into economic constraints and capacity constraints. But it seems clear to me that there's a lot of hope in the amount of innovation that we're seeing here. And what I'm really interested in exploring is, if if you take every one of those sort of verticals like renewable power, clean transport, mangrove restoration, coral restoration, maybe in one case it's a new investment fund, maybe in another case it's the coral fund, maybe there are different types of solutions, but I think if we can really think about how to aggregate so as to be able to bring in some of the expertise and capital from non-state actors from outside the region to work with non-state actors in the region to accelerate change. I think that's something really worth working on. I'm hoping that we can work together so that by the time we get to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in November, we've got a bit of an architecture for accelerating action in the region with support from many people who really want to help and need to find the right way to do that. So with that, Zarek, Lisa, thank you very much, and we'll draw an end to the conversation.